We shall go on to our capital perspective. So thinking about Salem in this context. All right, so in our next session, we're going to have several Oregon state representatives going to be discussing what's worked so far and comment on perspectives or prospects to update policies and increase funding for recovery efforts. So, having seen several of our representatives here in the room, actively listening, actively engaging in these discussions, I'm very hopeful that the lessons that you all are sharing with them, they'll be able to take back to Salem and create some more efficient and effective work in the future in this area. So our moderator for our next panel is Steve Adams. Steve, oh, right, there you are. Steve is the policy director for Lane County. And as Lane County's director of policy, he oversees a diverse portfolio encompassing community and economic development, housing, climate, emergency management, disaster recovery, intergovernmental affairs, and grants management. I don't know what he doesn't do, but I am dressed as Steve for Halloween today. So, there may be a few more costume changes later on. We'll see how that goes. So Steve has held lots of roles in state government down in Florida, worked in the EPA in DC, and is gracing us with his presence here in Lane County. So I'm going to hand the floor over to Steve and our panelists here. Thank you, Steve.
All right, Ben, you're laying it on thick. All right, good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure to join you. It's my great pleasure to introduce this next panel. Joining me, of course, is Representative Pam Marsh, who represents the 5th House District in the Oregon House of Representatives. That is Southern Jackson County. That covers Talent and Phoenix, of course, Ashland in that area. And of course, Rep. Marsh has been in the legislature since the 2016 cycle, if memory serves, and has been a real thought leader on wildfire recovery, particularly since the 2020 session. Also joining me is Representative Charlie Conrad, who represents Eastern Lane County. That's House District 12. And your district, Rep. Conrad, extends a little bit beyond Lane County, but Lane County is in fact the kind of center of your district. And before we get underway, I do want to recognize Senator Jama is with us today. Senator Jama is the chair, of course, of Senate Housing and Development. Senator, great to see you. Thanks for joining us. So let's begin. Rep. Marsh, I wonder, where were you on Labor Day 2020, and what did that day and that week look like for you?
Well, oddly enough, I was serving on the grand jury in Jackson County. I was in a little conference room in the DA's office in downtown Medford, and everybody's phone suddenly pinged. And we went outside and we saw this enormous black cloud of smoke sitting between where we were in Medford and Ashland. And when I got out of the grand jury, I went to the expo, which is our emergency operations. I knew of people, of friends who had lost their homes in the first flanks of the fire. And I went there to seek them out and to see what was going on and pick them up. We tried to find a hotel room for them. Eventually, we drove home in the circuitous way to get to Ashland and through the wall of fire that was consuming Talent at that moment and brought them to my house. The rest of the week was really mostly spent at the expo, trying to understand the magnitude of the disaster that had befallen us. And at one point, I was able to take a tour with local fire through the impacted areas when it was all closed off and looked at acres and acres and acres of devastation, what turned out to be the loss of 2,500 of the 4,000 homes that were lost statewide that weekend.
And Rep. Conrad, how about you? You had a little bit of a different experience that day.
I did. Thank you very much. Prior to being in legislature, I worked for local governments at the time. But the Labor Day fires hit, I was actually working at the Lane Event Center as the operations supervisor. So my role in that function was to actually work with Lane County Animal Services to set up the large animal evacuation shelter. So my day and my crew's day was setting up animal pens. It was working with how can we actually help the people that are evacuating? How can we prepare for their arrival? And what can we do? We were fortunate that the Lane Event Center We didn't have any competing events that we had to cancel and that we were able to accommodate them. We're actually able to use our existing facilities, able to use our animal panels, able to use everything in our resources to be able to accommodate the animals. At one point in time, we were well over 500 animals. We also had a few camping spots, so those folks that needed to have some assistance, we had some RVs there. Some of those folks were able to take care of their animals. And so that week really for me was getting that done. Lane County Animal Services did a fabulous job, setting up something that we had never done before, working in collaboration and, handling all the unintended things that came, just the number of volunteers that offered. Yeah, there were times that we had 40 or 50 people helping to take care of the animals. So just managing some of those processes that we'd never done before. So it was really a learning experience. The other side that we got was all the donations that came in. We had to set aside some separate rooms, some separate facilities, just to manage the food and the clothes and the outreach from the community that were dropping things off to help people that, had been evacuated and that were survivors. So it was a very trying week for me. It was a very fulfilling week for a number of different reasons. But the simple fact that we were able to take care of folks' animals so that they could take care of the other things that they needed to in their life, and that they knew the vets were there. They knew people were paying attention. It was great. It was a great experience, and I was happy to be able to do that.
Thank you so much. Reflecting now, Representative Marsh, you really led the way in the 2021 legislative session, the long session. Several key investments happened on the part of the state legislature. And I wonder if perhaps as you reflect back, what were some of the key accomplishments that year?
Sure. Well, from a government point of view, a couple of things happened most immediately after the fire and then a little bit later. Immediately after the fire, the governor, at that time, Governor Brown, put together the wildfire task force that Congresswoman Val Hoyle referred to earlier. I was a member of that. We really looked at the big picture. How are we going to queue up cleanup? What's the involvement potentially of FEMA? How do we approach a devastation that we've never seen before? On a more specific level, within the House of Representatives in the state on which I serve, the Speaker set up a special committee on wildfire recovery, and I served on that committee. And we started getting down to the details of what can we do, what can we pass, what do these communities need? And I would just call out a few pieces of legislation to describe kind of the breadth of issues that we were really confronted with, and the bills that we passed, much of which reflected exactly the experience that we were having on ground in community and the kind of input that we were receiving. For example, shortly after the fire, I heard from the state assessors who said that unless we changed property tax law here in Oregon, that most taxpayers would be paying property taxes on homes that were now non-existent. So we worked with the assessors and we came up with a very logical property tax change, which will apply, by the way, for any loss of home, that simply says if your house is gone, you may pay property tax on your land, but your property taxes are proportionally decreased to indicate that you no longer have a home. Pretty logical, right? But that we had to change the law to get there. We passed legislation based on input that we got from people around insurance who contacted my office and said, we have a year to rebuild. We don't have any idea how we will accomplish that. So we passed two pieces of legislation that were referred to yesterday, one of which gave people 2 to 3 years to rebuild and made a number of other changes, including allowing you to rebuild in a different location if that was better for you, allowing you to fold in coverage from exterior additional buildings into the construction of your main home, things like that. And then we passed a second bill that also based exactly on the input that we got from people saying that if you, your coverage for personal property, if your insurance company is requiring you to fill out these laborious inventory forms that caused extraordinary trauma to people, and you want to avoid that and move on, you can settle for 70% of your total coverage. That was something that we heard loud and clear was a tremendous burden to people who were asked to do it. So we had insurance that we had to deal with. Then we had schools. We realized that many of the fire impacted areas, including in our district with the Phoenix Talent School District, that unless we made some special efforts, these school districts would be tremendously disadvantaged in the funding formula over the next few years because schools get funding based on butts and seats. And if you have a fire and people are displaced, for a while, you're not going to have those butts and seats. So we passed legislation so that the 4 school districts, in particular, Phoenix Talent, McKinsey, Lincoln, Santiam, would have a few years in which their enrollment was based on pre-fire enrollment, which means that their budgets would be steady. So as communities rebuild, the schools are not punished for the fact that families are not back yet. That's still going to be an issue in many of those districts in 2025 because we're not going to be fully rebuilt, but we gave them some respite. And then we passed a lot of legislation around housing. In my community, the 2,500 homes included the destruction, either fully or largely, of 19 manufactured home parks. So we knew that manufactured homes were going to be a big part of the recovery. And over the last few sessions, we passed 4 pieces of manufactured home legislation just to really make sure that we can rely on those parks. We passed legislation guaranteeing that the parks can rebuild after they've been destroyed. We had to pass legislation that clarified the responsibilities of tenants after the disaster, because a lot of park owners were telling tenants that they were responsible for cleaning up the space of the manufactured home, which is basically disintegrated on site. We passed legislation saying, no, you're not. Once your house is burned down, you have no more responsibilities. We passed legislation referred to yesterday to allow modulars in parks, legislation to make sure that modulars and manufactured homes can be sited anywhere in a community, subject to no more restrictions than apply to brick and mortar homes. We broadened the use of the state's manufactured home purchase program, which I had established a couple of years prior with the idea of allowing people to trade out old manufactured homes for new homes. We knew that that program, if broadened and expanded, could be a great asset to wildfire survivors. So we did that. We passed, all in all, in that 2021 session, about $600 million to go to fire recovery. That was $150 million to housing. There's a lot of money that went to capital expenditures like the Phoenix Public Safety Building that was referred to yesterday. We put money into incentives for rebuilding around energy efficiency and home hardening and septic recovery. We put money into natural resource recovery. And I will say, in summary of all of this, and this is also perhaps part of a later conversation about gaps, we were really lucky that this happened at a time when we had money because we were able to do this. We had federal money. We also had an unexpectedly really good surplus in the state budget because it turns out while the pandemic was really hard on some people, some others did very well. So we were able to make investments that would have not been possible at another time, and still look at how difficult recovery has been.
Indeed. Thank you, Representative Marsh. And the American Rescue Plan Act funds were critical, certainly in that 21 cycle, and our federal delegation played a key role there. So Rep. Conrad, you had a perch in the 23 long session that just concluded on the House Emergency Management Committee. So the work wasn't done in 2021. What else happened from the legislative side of things in terms of advancing our capacity to respond?
Thank you. On the Emergency Management Committee, we had a number of hearings trying to pick up some of the gaps, some of the pieces from all the work that they did beforehand. I mean, just listening to Rep. Marsh, you can see that they tried to tackle just about every aspect that they could with the funds that they had, given the circumstance. So the fact that the legislature was able to do so much and be able to tackle that is magnificent. But we're all here in the room because we still all have a lot of work to do. And we did some of that in 23. For me getting into this realm, I loosely categorize things into people, processes, and things. And how are we looking at things and are we doing things right in each one of those buckets? In the people side, we did some things. We did some things with volunteers, looking at tax incentives. How can we help get people out there? We passed some legislation for public employees to be able to get some time off to go out and help and work when they're volunteering for emergency. We did some things for people that were impacted. We had a bill that went through and you can do a tax write-off for some of the property losses that you might have. We also expanded and extended the law that instead of having an RV on a property for 2 years, now you can have it for 5. So we did some things to try to help people on both sides of it, those impacted, but those also trying to fight them and responding to them. For the things side, we did grants, trying to get money out there, which is a common conversation for everybody in this room, is money. And sometimes that money goes to people because we need to pay people. Sometimes it goes to things. We need generators, we need food, we need facilities, we need different things. And so we did some things with Spire grants. We looked at some other funding measures, but still a lot more work to do out there, a lot of work to make it easier for everybody in this room that applies for those grants to get it. It was brought up, Senate Bill 606 was brought up yesterday. And I'm fortunate enough to be on that modernizing grant and contracting task force. And so my hope is that we can actually get a low viscosity pipeline going from the state government down to the businesses, down to the nonprofits, people actually doing the work that need the funds to make things happen. So I'm fortunate to be on that, and I'm hopeful that with the group of people that we have on that task force, we'll be able to do something good. And that really we'll be able to get a template that doesn't only impact this area, but it impacts all of the state for how we use grants, because we rely so much on nonprofits and local organizations to get the work done, that anytime that we put a barrier, and barriers have come up quite a bit, anytime we can overcome those barriers, and Rep. Marsh talked about some of them, great, let's do it. The more times we have to touch the money, the less money actually gets to the people that need it the most. So working on that, and Congresswoman Hoyle, you and I have the same thoughts on a lot of that. So I appreciated your comments as well. And the other part of it is processes. We didn't touch enough on processes this session. We did some for the State Fire Marshal Office, give her some authority, give her some abilities to do some things. As was brought up yesterday, we gave some authority and some powers to the OHCS director to do things to make things easier and more convenient. But again, on that process side, there's a lot of work to come, and we'll talk about that here, I think, in a couple minutes. So we did some work picking up some of the pieces, trying to scab things together, given that now we're 3 years in and that we're experiencing what recovery actually looks like. And I'm hopeful that we can continue doing that process, but make some bigger changes here next sessions.
Thank you, representatives. And you both anticipated my next question. And before I pose this, I really want to emphasize that both of our members today really wanted to design this panel in such a way that we created a lot of space for conversation and questions. So we're really kind of managing the time here such that we hear from you. But certainly we've had a full day here, and you both are representing districts and people who are doing the day in, day out work of recovery. Legislation over time is learning at a larger scale. We responded in 21 and you led the way. Additional work was required in 23. And certainly with the short session ahead and looking ahead to the 2025 session, it's not too early to begin to think about legislative concepts there. So I think Representative Marsh, I would love to hear your thoughts about gaps that are occurring to you. Where do we need to head next?
Well, I think gaps and sort of looking straightforward at them are the advantage of being able to identify those gaps and bringing together a group like this, which has such wisdom and such hard-earned lessons. So let me share some of my thoughts after listening over the last couple of days. First of all, I just want to reiterate that statement about we had funding for this event. We also had an event that rose to a level where we had federal support. There was no question but the state needed to look at different ways of organizing to respond to the disaster. The next year, we had the bootleg fire referred to yesterday, and none of those support systems were in place. I heard from a constituent who lives in Ashland but lost a ranch in the bootleg fire and said, there is nothing for us. We can't even deduct our losses. And it turned out that was in fact the case, because the federal government at some point said you can only deduct wildfire losses if it's a declared federal emergency. So that would have applied in 2020, did not apply to people who lost their homes after that. So we passed a bill, and now we have the ability, at least at the state level, to at least deduct the losses above your insurance payments in the event of a wildfire. That seems pretty basic. But we don't have those support systems in place, and the loss of your home, whether it was in bootleg or 2020, has the same effect on your family and the same devastating emotional and economic impact. So we have to figure out some enduring systems I would say we also have to grow our agencies. We realized in 2020 that I always had this fantasy that if there was a disaster, that the big wigs come in and take care of everything. It turns out they come in and they do not take care of everything, right? What we discovered is tremendous gaps in FEMA. In my community, we had struggles with Red Cross. We know that as a state, we need to be able to develop the capacity to step in and augment at the very least what we're getting from the federal government if you have a disaster that raises to that level. If it's not a federal disaster, you got to be able to do it yourself. That means we need a strong OEM, and we've made changes over the last couple of years so to bolster OEM so that it's no longer associated with the military department. We have a new leader that we met yesterday, which is terrific. We need to do the same thing for ODHS. We know that in disasters in my community, and I suspect this is the same in your communities, it was great to have OEM come in, help us with cleanup, the big pictures, negotiate with FEMA. And for the care and feeding of people, we absolutely relied on ODHS. So we have an ongoing conversation to make sure that we really have substantial, adequate FTEs within Orem, the resiliency arm of ODHS, so that they can keep coming into communities where there's a disaster, whether it's a big one or a small one, and help us with the care and feeding of people. So agency capacity is a big must-do on the list. We've got to figure out how to respond quicker, right? 3 years in, and we have single-family homes rebuilt, but we don't have homes for our most vulnerable people. I have thought, how can we do this differently? Why does it take so long? And the only thing that I've been able to come up with is that we need to start thinking about how we actually produce housing in a different way so that we can get it out on the landscape more quickly. And as a result, last year we put in the short session $15 million into St. Vincent de Paul in Lane County so that they can start their own nonprofit production of manufactured homes. Some of those manufactured homes I think will still wind up as response to the 2020 wildfires when they start producing them next year. We put $20 million into modular housing factories yet to be distributed because we want to bolster the modular housing industry in the state. All of this is with the assumption that when we have another disaster, we'll be able to go to these facilities and put the state in line to purchase units that we can have out on the landscape. This is the only way that the only strategy that I've been able to come up with doing it faster is thinking about it differently and producing housing in a different way. But certainly none of us are happy with the time frame that we've been stuck with. And certainly there is much more we need to do on building resilience within our own communities. This is, as we all know, not going away. So we need to build, and we passed a couple of bills in this last session. I'll just quickly call out. One of them allows counties up to $50,000 to develop their own resilience plan. So you have a county that will look at its geography, look at its institutions, and start to understand where we really need to have resilience so that in a disaster, we have places to go for people. I would encourage all of you from counties to tell your county to sign up for this $50,000 to do the plan so that then we have a blueprint so that we can start actually building out ways to be energy and physically secure in the next disaster. And the other bill we passed was about resilience in a different way, more resilience in terms of community connections. That's a bill that will put $10 million to be administered by ODHS into building resilience hubs and networks. This is about how do we bring community together? How do we build trust? How do we help people to understand where they're going to go and how they're going to be cared for in the next disaster? This is the work in front of us.
Thank you, Rep. Rep. Conrad, same question.
Thank you. And, I'll echo Rep. Marsh, it's the timeline. And so starting off at a broad scope of what I'm trying to figure out. So I'm a freshman legislature and, trying to, with the background that I've got, I was a police officer for 14 years. I've done emergency response. When I worked for Lane County Parks, I worked with FEMA and the program delivery manager doing reporting. So I've got some experience in emergency management realm. This is a new level for me. So trying to understand where we're at and how can we improve on that. And one of the things that struck me yesterday was that we talk about a linear time frame. And one of the comments from one of the panelists yesterday was at this current pace, it's going to take us 10 years to recover. That's linear. That's 30% every year. How do we turn a linear time frame into an exponential time frame? How do we get from 30%? How do we get to 50% in the next 18 months? How do we get to 70% 6 months after that? And some of that I appreciate is Rep. Marsh talking about, okay, housing is going to be a key part of that. But how do we change that curve? If any of you guys have any ideas, or if you're better at math than I am, please let me know. But I would love to figure out how we can do that, because that's where we need to be. That is how we're going to make systemic process improvements so that the next folks that have to go through this aren't at this point 3 years later, that they're much further along. And that as a state, we are there for them, that we've got our processes tried and true. We know where we need to go. Again, we've got that low viscosity pipeline. The money is out the door. The folks actually doing the work are doing the work. They know what they need to do. They know what their standards are. They know what their expectations are. And that as a state, that we are good to go and we're operating smooth and efficiently. So with that, we have got a lot of work to do in the short term. One of the things that was brought up is the schools. You know, McKenzie School District, which is in my district, is going to need some money. You know, the recovery of a community is slow, and that has significant impacts just beyond homes. It has impacts for everybody that would make up and live in those homes. And that's where we need to go. That's what we need to start looking at, is looking at that community perspective as well, looking at the people that make up that community and what we can do there. There are a number of different things. You know, Oregon Department of Forestry, their response this year was magnificent. They had 100% of their average fires, and we lost, if I remember the number right, magnitude I think is right, 6% of the landscape that we've historically have. And so much of that is to ODF and their response. And some of that is from the bills that were passed in previous sessions, 762, getting cameras out there on that landscape so they could get the fires before they got big. Huge. We have done some significant things in this state, and we just need to keep thinking along those lines of the whole process for the emergency management side of it, from the resiliency and preparedness, the response to the recovery side, and keep making some of these changes that are going to have significant impact. So I'm very hopeful going forward that these things, and people like Rep. Marsh and with the support from our federal delegation, that we can do this. The other side of this that looking at is, how do we manage our large timberlands from private timber owners that buttress up against federal lands? How do we ensure that both are managing their properties so to minimize that? We've heard yesterday that fire doesn't discriminate. It doesn't. It can start on state land, it can start on federal land, it doesn't matter. It's still going to go to the same community it's sitting there. We need to make sure that all aspects of our forest management practices are protecting in that community, that we are looking at how to harden those communities and give those protective borders and rings around there so that we've got quick and easy access, and that we have multiple escape routes for folks. Some of our communities, they're one way in, one way out, and we need to do a better job with some of that planning and management and thinking ahead. So there are a lot of big picture things to tackle there, but I'm hopeful that we can do it. We've got great people in the legislature, we got great people in this room, and I think putting our heads together, we can come up with that. So that's what I've got to offer on that.
Actually, your comments about prevention and which are so relevant reminded me of one more thing I'd put on the gap section, which I think we've done a good job gearing up our state fire marshal, starting to do good work in our forests around thinning, and we understand the value of defensible space. What we still need to do, and this was prompted by the discussion on my mind, the discussion yesterday, is we need a proactive home hardening program. We, as part of our wildfire package, we have given wildfire survivors who are rebuilding some incentives to rebuild in the most fire-resistant way possible. We need to be doing that proactively for people who live in our most vulnerable areas and who cannot do that themselves, because we know what the value of that is going to be.
Absolutely. Well, representatives, we've accomplished our task. We've left some time available for some questions. So I wonder if my colleagues could run microphones, and if there are any questions. I see just back here in the very center of the room.
One of the questions I have, thank you. Sorry, all I have are questions. Rep. Marsh knows this well. So we've talked a lot about the state level. We've talked a lot about the CBOs. One of the things that I feel has been incredibly beneficial in sort of my understanding the landscape of the disaster cycle and how nonprofit partners can navigate that is through the support of my local emergency manager, right? And we are fortunate that we have 3 emergency managers in Jackson County for Ashland, Medford, and the county, right? That is not the case in all of our communities. And ultimately, at the end of the day, when the rubber hits the road, that chain of command into ICS, into the structures that will release funds both across a region and down through the state and down through the feds requires a strong emergency management network. So as I hear about bolstering state systems, which absolutely needs to happen, I'm also really wondering what the strategies are to support and strengthen our local emergency management networks, because I live in fear, I'm gonna say the C word, of the Cascadia subduction zone, right? Like, a lot of our communities are gonna be on our own for months. And so the state's not gonna help us, the Fed's not gonna help us. Where did Kelly go? Kelly ran away. The one time you call someone's name, they're gone. But anyways, like, I need those emergency managers strengthened and supported so that they can manage what will be a very long response.
I appreciate that. And absolutely. One of the bills that I think did not pass was looking at emergency managers in local communities and funding that. And I don't remember the background on why that didn't go forward. The other thing that Patience Winningham is now Deputy Director of ODEM. And so I have great faith that the connection between the state and local emergency managers is going to be strengthened, and that is one of the areas that really we are going to prosper in. And so I'm looking forward to that.
I'll just add to Charlie's comment. I think there are some areas where we have made some support or some we've moved forward in terms of the state and local emergency response. Shortly after the fires, and actually we intended to do this before the fires, but ironically, we wound up doing it after the fires. The state really invested in the OR alert process. This is the state's emergency alert program. It turns out there were counties that had, prior to the OR alert program being deployed, had no emergency alerts of their own at all. And so now we have a statewide system. It backs up and provides more robust qualities to counties that already have their own system. And it provides a backstop for counties that had nothing in place before that. So those are the important building blocks that we really need to put in place, recognizing that many of our counties have very limited ability to build and fund emergency response. And the state is going to have to figure out how to be a backstop to those counties in any way that we can.
Thank you, Representative Marsh and Conrad. My name is Colleen. I work for SOREADY, which is the Economic Development Agency in Southern Oregon. There's been about 12 hours of time in this conference and about 40 minutes dedicated to business recovery. And so my question for you is, what is the state doing to provide incentives or other resources, could be non-financial, to businesses? Because without businesses in this state, we do not have economic revitalization. So it could be in response to emergencies like our fires. It could be additional support for Business Oregon or all the economic development districts. I would like to know what you are advocating for business recovery. Thank you.
I'll go first. I'm sure Rep. Marsh will have a much better answer than I have, because I completely agree. It is, when I started getting into this and talking to some of the local business owners in Blue River, the fact that there is nothing for them, that it is so difficult. And as I've looked into that, some of that, it's the federal regulations involved with that, some of it's sort of the loans. And there is a lot of work to do. I don't have a ready answer other than that is on the forefront of my mind of how can we actually do this much better than what we have done. A lot of what I've heard, particularly and anybody from the Blue River delegation, please correct me if I get any of this wrong. I trust you guys. But when you have a community that has smaller plots, when you have a community that was built back in the 40s with different standards and regulations, Now, the land use rules that we've got really impede it. The building regulations that we have impede. And at this point in time, I would love to be able to, one of the concepts that I have is somehow to declare it a recovery disaster zone, and that there are some things that can be waived. And I don't know, it's just a concept, but we need somebody that can step in and go, you know what? You don't need 11 parking spots, you can get 7. And you don't need this, you can do that. Build back to what you can, build back energy efficient, build back with the standards, the ADA standards that we have, build back what you can on the footprint that you have, and go forward from there, and not have continual studies, not have continual arguments, not keep having to go back to an architect. Everything delays, delays, delays. What are we doing to actually expedite that timeline? So I go back to an exponential timeline. How can we do that? Because we have all these barriers that do nothing but sandbag the system. Let's not do that. There are things that we have the ability to do. We just have to come and have somebody that is willing to make those decisions. And a lot of that will come from grassroots support from the people actually doing the work to get that message across, that we need to change things and we need to really help and support and move forward.
Thank you. I appreciate all those comments. I will say, I think in retrospect, looking back at the disaster that we had in 2020, that the needs of businesses were subsumed to some degree by the overwhelming need to get people into homes. We had this tremendous displacement of thousands and thousands of people. And so our effort was really focused for a very long time on making sure that we had first an emergency response, then we had intermediary housing, then we had FEMA, then we had the work of rebuilding long-term housing. And I don't think we paid as much attention to the loss of businesses or put as many resources as we could have into restoring those businesses. Now we have, as we discussed yesterday, some peer funding that's coming back. The 80% of our CDBG money is going to be put toward housing. I know that's probably some discussion, could be some discussion in this room about whether that's the right percentage. Coming from a community that lost so many homes, I see the need to put the vast majority of that money into housing. But we will get some money out of CDBG for peer efforts in Jackson County that may be support for some of the organizations that are working with local businesses to really help people in a very basic way get back on the ground, to try to identify the barriers and try to work one by one with businesses that are trying to relocate. I think overall, we really need to think deeply about what our business strategy should be next time, because I don't think that's something we can point to as being tremendously successful in this round.
Yeah, thanks. I'm a head down guy, and I don't, forgive me, but I don't spend a lot of time like reading all of the legislation. So I might have this wrong, but my understanding is that a lot of the bills that were passed are specific to the 2020 wildfires. And is there any thought to, you mentioned the schools, for example, of making that permanent, right? So that anytime a community experiences a disaster of this type, they can benefit from the legislation rather than having to come back and continue to do kind of one-off. So that's one question. And then I think we've heard a lot about the condition of community pre-event is really a determinant of how it's going to be post. And so are there legislative concepts being discussed about, you know, for example, construction funds that are blue sky day that can easily be pivoted to post-disaster support? So again, we don't have to necessarily have months of conversation and waiting for legislative sessions to achieve those ends or those goals. Thank you.
Sure. Well, I think definitely we need to figure out how to look at the things that we did successfully in 2020 and generalize them. And I don't know if you can write legislation that describes a school district in the particular position, and because you still have to allocate some money to make that program happen anyway. And you can't have money just sitting around waiting for the next disaster. But we do need to figure out how to quickly jumpstart the programs that we know are successful so that people don't have to wait around and we don't have to create them. That was frankly one of the problems we had in 2020 is we created these great programs and it took months and months and months and months before we are actually able to help people to the extent that we needed to help them. We are doing some things. The home hardening incentive that is for wildfire survivors has been extended so that anybody who lost their homes in 2021 can also apply. I'm going to run a bill through my committee in the next session, which will open it up to wildfire survivors from whatever disaster, because we know people who are needing to rebuild, regardless of when that was, can use some support in making sure that they're building as fire-resistant homes as possible. Beyond that, I'm not sure what the path is in terms of being able to jumpstart programs that will be immediately available to people, other than to really make sure that we have state agencies with the capacity to respond immediately. That means OEM needs to be able to go in right away. That means DHS needs to be able to step in and house people, whether it's 10 homes or 5 homes or 300 homes, because those are we're depending on the capacity of those organizations.
Yeah, I agree, and I appreciate that question. One of the things that I look at as legislation does come forward is it necessarily restrictive or is it unnecessarily restrictive? And to be able to look at it in that context, there are some things that on the political side that you need to have it necessarily restrictive. I need to identify the school district and how much money they're getting, because if I open it up, it's going to have such a huge fiscal impact that nobody's ever going to support it because it's going to be contributing or competing for other funds. So it's identifying those two things, but ensuring that the legislation that we do pass, like when we do pass legislation about how long you can have an RV on your site, let's just use the word disaster and not from this. So there are times when it's appropriate, and that's certainly a lens that I go through and filter through and ask those questions.
We have time for one more.
Thank you, Brandy Crawford Ferguson, Mackenzie Community Land Trust. And as I mentioned in my presentation yesterday around, we're not experts, but we now have 3 years of experience in this room. One of the things I really want to elevate that I don't think we've talked about at this summit yet, which is a huge shout out and acknowledgement for the Community Rebuilding Fund. Our 3 statewide foundations, Oregon Community Foundation, Ford Family, as well as Meyer Memorial Trust, and then Red Cross joined later. The impact of that fund when they came together immediately, joined forces, and gave us the opportunity as nonprofits and communities to apply for funding, not immediately, but gosh, it was quick. And the low barriers around those applications, that I don't know where we would be today without the Community Rebuilding Fund. And I don't believe there's any of those foundations in the room today. I'm hoping they're zooming in. But wanting to shout out, that was something that worked. And how can we leverage those foundations that pivoted, that want to help, and maybe passing some of these dollars down through them? This is kind of what they do, and they did it well. Maybe there's a partnership opportunity, and just wanting to kind of shout that out as we're talking about grants and where our gaps are after these 3 years. What could we look at that worked as we're moving forward?
I am so glad that you mentioned philanthropy, because in many ways they are setting a course for where the rest of us need to go. Those philanthropic organizations that are participated in fire recovery meet on a regular basis to really take stock of lessons learned and to be ready so that they can respond on a moment's notice to the next emergency. And they have in fact stepped in to emergencies post 2020 and been able to offer some immediate support. We probably need to copy that approach in government so that we can do the same thing.
Yes.
All right, and with that, please put your hands together for our 2 members.